so much of what makes traveling with kids hard, getting outside with kids hard, is our own anxieties. And I think recognizing like what are the things that are hard for my child and what are the things that are hard for me. You may not be able to fully overcome either of those, but I think separating them in my head was often helpful of like, oh, it's not that my son is freaked out and overheated. It's that I am freaking out that he could get overheated. And like distinguishing even that language there helped me recognize like, where is the stress coming from? What am I thinking about? And where is my head going? And I think that sort of applied to a lot of other cases of anxieties and stressors.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has the goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 121 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, I sat down to talk with an entrepreneur, world traveler, and devoted mother about how, over the course of her life, the way that she gets outside has changed and evolved. We all enter new seasons of life, and our individual circumstances greatly influence how we actually spend time outdoors, and how much time we probably spend outdoors too. Having children is always a big life change, and as someone who doesn't have children, I was excited to hear firsthand how more families can continue to get outside and help their children safely enjoy the outdoors with them. Jocey Newman is a mom, entrepreneur, and outdoor enthusiast. She's the founder of First Peak, a line of sustainable adventurewear for babies and toddlers, inspired by her own time in the outdoors with her young son, and a desire to create more durable, eco-friendly items for our littlest explorers. She recently wrapped up 15 months of nomadic travel with her family across 4 continents and is now resettling in California with baby number 2 on the way. She hopes her story and her products can encourage more families to feel confident to get outside together. Right now, listeners can get an exclusive 10% off any First Peak products by using the code Outdoor Minimalist at checkout. Before we get to the interview, I just want to remind everyone that last week, the official trailer for the Forever Chemicals podcast was released. You can listen to it exclusively on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast page, and soon more sneak peeks will be coming through. So if you want to stay up to date with the latest, be sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. And to support our work in producing the upcoming podcast series, please consider donating to our GoFundMe. The link is in the show notes. So thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, Jocey. I want us to start off with my classic guest question, which is, how did you first get involved in outdoor recreation and how does it fit into your life now?
Yeah, first off, I'm super excited to be here. When I was thinking about this question, I was wondering, because I've listened to a series of episodes, I was wondering how different this is from the norm, but I didn't really get into outdoor recreation until I was a bit older. I was definitely an athlete growing up. I grew up in Southern California. I spent a lot of time outside, but primarily for organized sports. And I think in adulthood, when I moved up to the Bay Area, and started working in like a tech-forward space with a lot of screen time, both consciously and subconsciously, I think my body had this draw to get away from the screens, to get out into nature. And there was such an amazing wealth of nature in the area that I quickly in my early 20s just started falling in love with getting outside and unplugging and getting away. And so it's sort of just been this massive part of my adult life and a big part of my life and journey as a new-ish parent.
Yeah, I would say like answers to that question kind of vary. Most people probably started recreating when they were kids, but I have had several guests that didn't start until they were adults. So it's interesting to hear kind of like their perspectives and like how they entered the outdoor industry. And so are you located in the Bay Area now as well?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you from there?
I'm from Southern California, but I've been here for a little bit over 10 years, probably 12 years-ish now.
Nice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you are a new-ish mother. That's going to be a big focus in today's episode. And so before that, before you were a mom, you
Yeah.
still liked getting outside. And so what was kind of your perception of like families outside and adventuring with kids before you had any of your own?
The thing that was so funny when I became a parent, and I think this applies to recreating outside and all sorts of things, is you realize that you sort of like overlooked all the parents and families before. Like I would, I think when I was just doing my own thing, I wouldn't even totally necessarily notice all these other families out with young kids. And if I did notice them, it would be this almost like distant, amazing, like super parent group that like felt, very different from me. And I think now that I am a parent, getting outdoors and being on trails and being in the backcountry, you feel like you're seeing the parents everywhere. You're seeing the families everywhere. Now they're just like my eye is attuned to find them and discover them in all the hidden places they may be.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like, okay, I shouldn't compare it to this, but it's like when you get a new car and then you
Oh,
start
car.
noticing those cars all the time. It's like it's a part
Exactly.
of your life now, and before it wasn't. So it's like, oh, now I realize how many people are out there actually doing this.
Totally.
Um, so did your obviously having a child is a big life change.
Yep.
But did how you recreate change a lot, or were you able to kind of adapt with your kids?
More the latter. I think the things that change are like mindset and style more than content, perhaps. Like we do a lot more, and I think it's also changing as my son grows older, and now we have a second one on the way, so it probably all will reset in a couple of months as well. But when he was really little and we could just strap him on my front or my back, a lot of our plans were very similar. Like there was obviously some logistical upfront of when will he eat and what are we bringing and how much are we packing with us. But by and large, we would do a lot of the same trails we had always done. Then as he started like toddling a bit, it was okay, and got heavier, like how long can I carry him? What does he want to do? And now I have a full-flung 3-year-old who has strong opinions. And so it's a lot more of, if we can get 2 miles done, we feel great. But if he gets to lead, we feel even better. And so how do you change your perspective from being about the destination to being about the journey, quite frankly, and just sort of being outside together and finding different things to climb or explore or dig into, all being part of the fun as opposed to just sort of like the extremity of distance or altitude or something like that.
Yeah, that is really interesting how I guess not necessarily the activity changes, but like the way you perceive it might alter. Do you think that you had any misconceptions about what it would be like recreating with a child?
I think the biggest like misconception more broadly that I think I felt some of was that like it just wasn't a thing you would do. Like, and I hear so many parents say this of like, oh yeah, like we used to love that trail, that park, that part of the country, but we just had a kid, so one day. And it's just this like foregone conclusion attitude, like we'll get back there eventually. And I think a lot of my misconception was just around what was possible to do, and what could still be fun. Like we, this year did 2 week-long bike treks with our son on the back that like people told us we were absolutely nuts to do. But then zooming out, I was like, people go on long drives with their kids all the time. Why can't my son sit on the back of a bike for a couple hours and then take a break and run around and be outside all day and then get back on a bike? And so I think it's the biggest misconception for me was breaking down this barrier of just possible impossible. And once I got through that, I think a lot of it was just how do you rebuild your expectation set and uh, have like patience and like embrace this sort of like the world as amazing perspective that kids do bring a ton of, which is fun.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I am trying to think if I have any like misconceptions about like families getting outside, but that would probably be like the main one where like a lot of people that I know that would be around my age that have kids, like they kind of stop doing a lot of those things. And I mean, perhaps you have to stop for a while because you give birth and that's a whole
For sure.
other process. Um, but what do you think like What was kind of that process then of you had a baby and it was really nice, I'm sure. Um, but then like when did you decide like, yeah, we're gonna take him outside and he's gonna explore these things with us?
Yeah. I think, and you're so spot on that like there is this like healing recovery process, like mentally, emotionally, physically, obviously. I think for me, getting outside with him was a huge part of that for me. Like I felt healthier and more myself and more alive being able to get him outdoors. He also, my son was born November 2020. So it was also like the thick of COVID. And so getting outside is one of the few places we could get together as a family. Um, and that was really powerful for us. Like the outdoors was like our haven. I also think like maybe it was to your question of like when did we decide? I think it was a much more gradual ramp up of, it was less of when's the first big hike we'll do, but it was more of what's the first time we're going to go like deep into the Presidio as a family, or what's the first time we'll traverse the Golden Gate Bridge and go into like the Marin Headlands. Like it was more about like how far away from home will we get, how long will we be out of the house, like that's more how we thought about it. But there was this sort of baseline assumption that like every day we'll get outside with our kiddo because we all need it, and it's just a matter of like stretching those boundaries of how far we took it.
Yeah, and I like that you have the perspective of like different ages or slightly different ages because he was an infant, now he's a toddler. So I guess what did that process kind of look like? So how did you prepare yourself and your child to do those things?
Yeah. So a lot of it was we had a lot of like packing lists in the early days. And I think this is a lot of new parenting is like you are inundated with information, like you're just making lists of everything. You're always trying to be over prepared. Like being grossly over prepared feels great as a new parent. And so very often, like we would be going on like a 3 mile day hike with like a full pack because we're like, we're just gonna bring everything and it's gonna be fine. So I think a lot of our preparation in the early days was have more than we think we need so that there aren't like these doubts of feeling of being stuck or too far away. And I think a lot was also just like that gradual buildup of baby steps of like getting outside and like recreating with your family could be the walk to the community garden. It could be the like short 10-minute drive to the big park or the longer trip, the longer trip. And I think a lot of our prep was just practice. I remember the first time we got our like kid carrying pack, I just like wore it around the neighborhood all the time with my son in it because I was so curious if it would freak him out, if he would hate it, love it, fall asleep in it. And so it didn't mean that we needed some big moment to try it. I just looked kind of goofy and walked around with my son in a backpack, like going to the grocery store. And that also was a great way to feel more confident or more prepared.
Do you think with your second child, the approach would change at all or be any different?
Oh yeah. I feel like I already with baby number 2 on the way, like I am just going to be like chiller, I think, or so I hope. Like that need to over prep, I think there'll be a lot less of. Because I think with, so much of navigating being a first time parent is like you lack both skills and confidence. Uh, and there's this new workload. And I think with baby number 2, it's like, okay, I know I have some skills, I know I have some confidence, and the load is still going to be huge, but at least I have those like 2 foundational elements. So my hope is that with like a couple of skills, a little bit more confidence, like I'm hoping that the approach can be feel less like there needs to be a lot of practice up front. At the same time, if like it does take a little bit of practice, and even like getting my son used to new baby being there will be a whole experiment in and of itself. There'll still be some of that preparation, but I'm hoping I can like dial it down a little too.
Yeah, I could imagine that like it's just a huge shift. You're a lot just used to having a tiny human with you. So adding a second one obviously is a lot of work, but wouldn't necessarily be as daunting, I would assume.
Totally.
This podcast is sponsored by Diorite Gear. Diorite Gear sells sustainable trekking poles handmade in their Portland, Oregon workshop. By taking ownership of their production, Diorite Gear is able to minimize their trace in manufacturing and in the environment, while their poles' recyclable and easily repairable components allow you to do the same. As someone that hikes daily and often in the Cascade Mountains or its foothills, trekking poles have become a staple in my gear lineup. The diorite poles not only have comfortable cork handles, but I also love the adjustability, durability, and overall performance no matter the time of year I happen to be hiking. Use the code MINIMALIST for 15% off your first order. So, I mean, it sounds like you did a lot of legwork ahead of time to kind of like prepare yourself and your son to get outside, which I think is really great. And so I would still assume that there was some challenges. So, what do you think were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in that experience?
Yeah, I think logistics is like one overarching theme. Like I remember just feeling like the logistical weight of when am I gonna breastfeed him? Do I need to bring snacks? Like what is his nap schedule today, and where will we be at the time that he's intended to nap, and what do we do if and when he falls asleep at some opportune time and like throws his whole schedule off. That was certainly this like running back of the mind tally that was always going on in my head, especially in the early trips. And I think a lot of what it required to push through that was just like a sense of calm that tomorrow is a new day. So like even if nap schedule is like lit on fire today, like tomorrow will be a new day and that's fine. And like even if feeding schedule is a little funny for today, tomorrow will be a new day. I will say like obviously I had the luxury of like a healthy kiddo, and like I was able to be a little laissez-faire with some of those things, and I know that's not the same for every family, but I think the more that we are able to embrace a like today will be funky, we'll see what tomorrow is, like that really helped. I think the other one frankly was like packing clothes. Like I distinctly remember this experience of we took our first trip to Yosemite with our son, and he was probably 6, 7 months. And we were all geared up. We finally found like a parking spot. We were like about to hit the trail. And like as we're pulling him out of his car seat, he like squirted his entire bottle down the front of his shirt. Uh, and we were like, okay, like that's not such a big deal. Like it's just a little milk, like he'll be fine. Keep on moving. Like we really want to get going. We sort of strapped him onto my front, and a minute later he like spits up on himself. And we're like, okay, just a little bit, wipe him down, like keep going, keep going. And 15 minutes later, I was like, it's now baking in the sun, and he he smells rancid, right? Like he's just really uncomfortable. He's like squirming in his clothes. Um, 30 minutes later, I think, or we like sort of dried him off and made sure like nothing wet was touching his skin. 30 minutes later, we noticed that like a lot of the design of basic onesies, the sleeves are almost like a 3/4 length. And like his hands and wrists were like clearly getting a little pink, like not full on burn, but like there was a lot of sun going on there. And he wanted to suck his thumb, and we were trying to cover his hands up. And that was this whole battle. And so I think for me, it was like, okay, there's the journey of how many changes of clothes do I actually need to bring for him for just like a day hike? How many diapers I need to bring, how many shirts, how many pants, and also like, are those clothes even like made for what we are doing right now? I can't personally fathom the idea of like doing a long adventure in like 100% cotton pastels, and I don't think any adult would ever do that since like 1985. And so it was just like, why is my son dressed in such a way that like he's uncomfortable, he's moist, he smells like he's not covered up? And how much gear do I have to bring to just like push through that?
Yeah, so did that specific experience, is that what kind of inspired you to start your company First Peak, or what is that kind of origin story?
That was sort of the trip. We got home that night. We had been doing that whole camping trip with two other friends, and that night I was like, I just want tiny Patagonia for my son. Like I want like miniature athleisure for him. And we were like, yeah. And then, my friends would say, why? And I was like, look at me. Like I'm walking around with like my hands are fully covered, but it's fully breathable. Everything's stretchy. Everything is purpose built to be outdoors. I know where it was made in a lot of cases, and like I know it was made locally or in the US, and I just like had a much clearer story. And we came back from that trip with sort of my commitment of like, I will just Google and go buy the thing. And then I Googled and couldn't find the thing. And so that was sort of the origin story of where First Peak came from, was all right, if I can't go find it, what would it take to make it for my son? And so knowing nothing about manufacturing, I figured out, I, cold called a whole bunch of places and learned a ton about like innovative, sustainable fabrics, and just sort of geeked out on the whole thing with the goal of like literally making like 2 onesies for my one child. And then had a few friends be like, wait, what is that? Like, tell me about it. And I was like, okay, I'll make 15 onesies for a few children. And it sort of grew from there.
That's so cool. It's like a very organic story, and like even the growth sounds very organic. Like your other mom friends would be like, that's what I need and want.
Yep.
And so since the inception of First Peak, I guess you have still spent a lot of time outdoors with your son, and you've gone on some like pretty long extended trips. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious how like your planning and experiences were on some of your more extended adventures versus something like a day hike.
Yeah. So in June of 2022, my husband and I both decided to leave our 9 to 5s. And we had this long standing dream of going on a year-long international trip. We really wanted to like backpack around, pack really light, and just like see a ton of the world. Uh, COVID had happened, a baby had happened, like all of these plans had been delayed. And we decided basically that like before our kids were in school was a better time than waiting for like some very, very distant date to do it. So we donated, gave away, sold everything we owned, basically ended our lease, and left the Bay Area with 2 backpacks and a stroller. Started that year with a cross-country road trip across the US. Ended up finding a cheap flight to Europe, spent about 3-4 months bopping around Europe. Ended up in Mexico on a couple more US road trips, Australia, New Zealand, East Asia. It was a whirlwind that was, and ultimately 15 months long, and entirely with those 2 backpacks and a stroller. So we never checked a bag. We like really wanted to keep it as light and minimal as we could, on the whole journey. I think from a planning perspective, what that required was, one, like a real purity of thought of like, what do you actually need for this amount of time? It's such a contrast what I was saying with the early days when you're like packing everything you could possibly fathom, that we had sort of graduated to this point of like, okay, what are the key essentials? And you know, First Peak clothes were very helpful for my own son, certainly. He made the whole trip with, I think, 4 short sleeve shirts and 2 long sleeve shirts, right? Like it was pretty lean. And my husband and I similarly were pretty lean packers. And I think also it was, acknowledging that there was a version of this trip that like my husband and I did together if we were 25 years old and it was just the two of us, that was all about like see as much as humanly possible and go as fast as you can. And then there was the version that was our reality, which was deeply enmesh yourself in places for longer periods of time and allow our son to like settle into a new environment and a new space a bit more. And like, he's going to need more time to fully experience it. So our pace and our approach was much more of a like, go, 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 nice, long, slow stint somewhere. Go, 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 nice, long, slow stint somewhere. Which I think the trip probably would have looked very different 10 years earlier in our lives. But I actually think was like uniquely fruitful because of that pace change. Like I felt like we really got to know places in a very different way.
Yeah, that's kind of how I like to travel too, is kind of like stay in a spot longer so you can kind of immerse yourself in the culture a little bit more.
Yep.
And it makes sense that that's what would work for a smaller child, I guess, because they're experiencing a lot so fast, I think. Overstimulating in my
Yep.
head. But the whole experience, like that seems very daunting to someone like me that doesn't have children. I'm like, I don't even know what I would do in those situations, like going to new places and like getting on planes and trains. So, did he outgrow any of his clothes? I'm curious.
He did. So the thing, part of how we combated the overwhelm was we planned in 3-month chunks. So never did we have a commitment to even going longer than those 3 months or any sort of plan on like where on the planet we would be 3 months later. And so it felt a lot more tenable to be like, okay, but for the next 3 months, like generally, what are we doing? And between each of those chunks, we very often would find our way back to the US briefly, in part so I could check on the business, in part because the grandparents were desperate for baby time, but also in part of like, if there was like a critical thing outgrown, how do we get something new and donate what we had? Um, I think generally, like we left, he was a year and a half, and one of the beauties as kids get older, like yes, they're still growing very fast, but the clip does normalize a bit more. So you didn't have, it wasn't like he had a shirt for 3 months and he was totally outgrown. He has pieces now that he's been able to hold on to for a year plus, because we sort of started him a little big and let him grow into them. But we had those check-in moments to be able to sort of reevaluate like which of these pieces is still working and which one isn't.
Yeah. Wow. So much thought.
We
So
figured it
much.
out better as we
So much.
went.
No, I bet it's like the practice thing, like you're saying with adding a second child. It's like now you've done all these things and
Yep.
you know what to do, kind of like what to expect, what challenges you might face. And so with all of your different experiences, what I guess advice would you give to parents that do want to do trips like this, whether it is they're traveling internationally or even domestically with their kids, or they want to go on a backpacking trip, or maybe they just want to spend a little more time outside?
I think my biggest one is like start small and feel really darn good about starting small, right? Like I think for us, the thing that made us confident to try these bigger, crazier things was the road trip from San Francisco to San Luis Obispo, right? Like that's like a much smaller trip, but still felt so monumental at the time and like let us gradually build that confidence. I think sometimes parents will say like, oh, I'm not that hardcore. Like all I do is something that's also totally badass. They'll be like, oh, I'm not that hardcore. I didn't go travel for 15 months, but like I did like a good chunk of the PCT with my 4-year-old. And I'm like, you are so hardcore. Like, what are you talking about? And I think there's also the parents who say like, oh, I'm not that extreme, but I do love to get outside every day with my kid. And I'm like, that is still incredible. So I think it's like start small, celebrate the small. Um, I think the other is that so much of what makes traveling with kids hard, getting outside with kids hard, is our own anxieties. And I think recognizing like what are the things that are hard for my child and what are the things that are hard for me. You may not be able to fully overcome either of those, but I think separating them in my head was often helpful of like, oh, it's not that my son is freaked out and overheated. It's that I am freaking out that he could get overheated. And like distinguishing even that language there helped me recognize like, where is the stress coming from? What am I thinking about? And where is my head going? And I think that sort of applied to a lot of other cases of anxieties and stressors.
Yeah, do you have any other, I guess, like pieces that other than starting small, and kind of like building up to it that would kind of help foster that confidence to be able to try maybe a longer hike or letting your kid choose the hike, like those types of things?
I wonder if there is a like not going at it alone. Like we would do one of the things when we did our first cross country road trip when we first left California. Along the way, I had just joined like a few outdoorsy mom Facebook groups. And I would post like I felt like a total weirdo, but I would just be like, I'm driving across the country right now. I'm stopping in these 4 cities next. Is anyone here who wants to go hiking with me and their kids? And like these other families would reach out and we would meet up and they would pick the trail and they would show me some new place. And I think getting out with other families, you also realize like the vast variety of what getting outside can look like and different approaches and like all sorts of handy tips and tricks people had. I think a lot of like, especially at that like 8 to 18 month phase was just like, ooh, what kind of snacks did you bring? Like, oh, they're really into like that, those cinnamon Cheerios are the winner or whatever it is. Like just picking up those small things, you start to feel like you're creating this like amalgamation of like best practices as opposed to writing the guide yourself.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that is so fun too, because you kind of get like a tour guide for that area.
Oh,
You
for
can
sure.
see like the best secrets versus the first trail that comes up on all trails or something like
Yep.
that. So that's a really cool approach. And I've found that those like Facebook groups have been like really great for meeting people in new areas. So Definitely recommend, even if you don't have kids, they have it for like different types
For
of
sure.
activities and ages, everything.
Totally.
And I'm realizing now that like I kind of skipped over some of like the first peak, um, I guess like uniqueness in baby
Yeah.
clothes, or not baby clothes, children's clothes.
Yep.
Um, because you mentioned when you were at Yosemite with your son, like he was wearing cotton, he got wet, it was gross and probably
Yes.
uncomfortable for him.
Yep.
And unfortunately, babies only express discomfort in certain ways. So I guess like, is it mostly made from wool, or what did you do to kind of like make it a better piece of apparel for kids to get outside?
Yeah. So a lot of what I would do was I ended up in the like world of textile innovation. So a lot of that was learning about wool, but it was also learning about tencel, modal. There's a fabric we use for our flannel shirts at First Peak called seawool, which is made from upcycled oyster shells and discarded water bottles. And it's like this hugely sustainable, recyclable material that feels a lot like wool, but isn't a traditional pure wool. A lot of it also was leveraging technologies of infusing silvers and golds and coppers into threads, which you see a lot in like Lululemon, Patagonia, a lot of these like backcountry shirts that are safely and naturally odor resistant and bacterial resistant. And so I would basically cold call a lot of these biotech companies, frankly, and just say like, I want to learn about your products. And I like put a little bit on like my science geek hat on and say like, and I want to see like safety white papers on how you know that this can be safe enough for a kid's skin, a baby's skin. Um, and people were excited to chat. I think like a lot of times I would get a hold of someone who was on the ground floor of developing these technologies and they wanted to get it into new spaces and they wanted to see it expand. And hearing about like the use case of getting outside. A lot of them were often in like adult performance wear and outerwear apparel or athleisure. And we're curious to see it in a kid space. And basically from there, I would order a bunch of samples, uh, make something up, test it on my own kid, let him spill on himself and then sniff it a day later kind of thing. And I think to sort of answer part of your question of like, the features that mattered most to me were, can it dry quickly? Can it not get really stinky? I got everything UPF tested. Like, is it actually sun safe and sun protected? And is it like comfy, stretchy, durable that if I were a small child who moves my body in all sorts of crazy ways, like would I want to move around in it all day long? And so I think I sort of had this feature checklist in my head and was able to kind of vet different fabrics along the way. And one of the things that's I think still so fun about the business is going to trade shows, seeing millions of fabrics, talking to these people who are creating new stuff in the space, and just continuously trying to find stuff that is better for the planet, but also like really safe, really comfy, and better for getting outside in.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'm interested to kind of hear about like how those innovations will kind of like change and evolve over time, especially as your kids get older and maybe their needs change outdoors because you'll have to like adapt in some ways. So I'm assuming that you probably started with like the onesie design, but have you expanded since then?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because so basically when I started with a onesie and a bib were like the two things, which now feel like a phase of forever ago. And I went up to an 18-month size, I think, when I launched. And then I had this moment of like, oh crap, my son is almost 18 months. We need bigger sizes. And as he's aged, he's sort of like pulled the line upward. And now that he's 3 and we only go up to a 4-year toddler size, I'm like, yep, 5 and 6 are gonna have to come soon because he's my star model and like he's my big product tester. But I do think beyond just like sizing was also what are the types of pieces I needed and wanted. So like obviously once onesies and bibs weren't our bread and butter, short sleeve and long sleeve t-shirts did become that. I then started to find that I had these basics sort of on lock, but what I was still really struggling to find were like good layers for him for getting outside. Just like a sweatshirt that wasn't gonna fall apart or get really like smelly, slimy, gross. So we started making sweatshirts and like flannel shirts to have like a comfy layer that you could bring along. Um, I just recently launched overalls and I'm working on pants for January. And it was similarly this like I see these pieces and they fall apart, they don't fit as well, they tear, they stain really fast. So I think to your point, like as his development has progressed, I guess, I'm like needing new things for him and then looking at the market and being like, oh, I don't like any of these solutions. Like, let's go try and build one again. And so it's sort of this like research development cycle every time.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm kind of thinking back to like the different things that I've done outside throughout my life, and clothing did play like a really big role in like how much I enjoyed that experience. Like if I wasn't dressed properly, I really didn't have a good time. And so I could imagine for kids, like maybe they don't like an activity because they're uncomfortable the whole time
Yeah.
and they just need a different approach. My name is Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental journalist investigating the rise, pollution, and now regulation of a class of chemicals known as PFAS. Throughout this 10-part series, you'll hear from guests from all around the world who have a stake in the legislation, production, and use of PFAS chemicals. They'll answer questions like, what is PFAS?
PFAS is a very big group of fluororganic chemicals and polymers. They have a fully fluorinated or perfluorinated moieties in the structure, at least one, meaning that at least one carbon is all bonded to fluorine and not hydrogen.
Why is PFAS used so widely?
They are exceptionally high performance chemicals. They work very, very well at what they do. Primarily, they're designed as coatings or as films. They resist heat, they resist oil, they resist grease, they resist water, and they bond very tightly.
Why is PFAS dangerous?
Due to this bond, the fluorine-carbon bond, they have what we call extraordinary properties. Carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest we know in organic chemistry. And that's one of the main reasons that PFAS are persistent. And that means that there are no known degradation products in the environment. They don't mineralize.
And how can we move forward as an industry?
What's been great about the outdoor industry is we're talking about it. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody is being quite open, I think, in sharing. Everyone's got their maybe some brand technologies and things that are more confidential, but broadly, people are talking, and product designers are talking, and material management is talking about it. And I think that's the key. That's how we'll accelerate, towards the finish line, is by not holding back information and trying to be open and share as much as we can.
Tune in March 2024 to hear this 10-part podcast series. As the host and creator of this show and Black-Footed Ferret Productions, it is my goal and mission to provide free and accessible information for all. We're an independent podcast and rely on listener donations to produce content like this. To donate, follow the link in the show notes. And thank you for making this production a possibility. What about for moms? Like, do you make anything specific for moms, especially when their babies are really small, maybe they're breastfeeding?
I don't yet, and I've thought a lot about it. And I actually think it's probably the type of thing that will become increasingly top of mind approximately, 8 weeks from now or whenever it is that this baby shows up. Because I do think that, exactly what you were just touching on of babies are uncomfortable in the clothes they're wearing. As like a mom, especially during the breastfeeding period, early days of even baby wearing, like the sweat and buildup and temperature regulation of having another human on your body is a pretty a meaningful experience of how a hike can feel. I think I've gone back and forth on do I feel ready to tackle clothes for moms? It is one of these things that I feel like, especially I was so new to this world in this industry, like I had no manufacturing experience. I'm like, okay, I just sort of got my feet out from under me on like baby and toddler. It feels like maybe I'm ready to shake it up again. I don't know. Like I think like I'm at a moment where maybe more discomfort or more uncertainty or stretching it a little like might actually be a good time to consider.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how things develop then as you have more children and your experiences. Like it seems like a lot of your experiences are really influencing your product line. So it will probably grow and change as your whole family does.
Exactly right.
Yeah, that's really cool. So Now I'm just trying to think. That's like mostly the information I want to cover. So like the kind of the final thing that you may want to relay to listeners, which I'm assuming maybe they have a baby on the way, maybe they already have kids, whatever it may be. If there's one message that you could give to new parents that want to get outside more with their kids, what would it be?
I think I'd say take one walk outside today. Like, I think if you want to start getting outside with your kids, like get out of your front door right now. And I think that is the best foundational skill there is. And like, you can make it as like goofy and hard mode as you want. Like, you could try to do it with a kid on your back. You could try to do it even if it's raining and kind of frigid right now. You can try to do it and see how long it takes you to get out the door. But I think get outside today and maybe find one friend who will get outside with you tomorrow. Like, would be the places I'd probably urge parents to start.
Yeah, having a community I could see being very, very helpful in that journey, especially as a new parent. That's awesome. I love hearing about your experiences. It's such a different world from mine, so it's kind of fun to kind of just explore it. And so how can listeners learn more about you and First Peak?
Yeah, so our website is www.firstpeak, and that's peak, P-E-A-K, like the first mountains they will ever climb. And it's firstpeak.co.co. And the other thing I'll mention is that any listener can use the code Outdoor Minimalist for a 10% discount at checkout. So I hope that folks will feel inclined and welcomed and encouraged to check it out. The blog on there also has a bunch of like travel and outside tips and like stories from our own experience. And definitely shop if it feels like this is going to fulfill a need for your family or a friend's family or whomever.
Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned the blog because I was going to ask if you had like resources for people that maybe weren't sure about certain things, but I'll be sure to link your website, and I'll also link your social media, which I think you said is First Peak Baby.
It is
for like Instagram and stuff. So a bit of a name difference, but you can find all of the links to the website, social media in the show notes. So it'll be easy to find. But with that, Jocey, I'm so glad you had time to sit down and chat.
This was super fun. Thank you so much for having me and for like all sorts of fun questions. I feel like I had a good day of reflection and thinking, just going back through all these experiences.
That's awesome.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.